Let's talk about one of the most powerful story types out there, the coming-of-age story. You know the ones. They're the stories that really stick with us, the ones that show us what it even means to grow up and find our way in the world.
Of course you have. I mean, just think of any book or movie where you've got a young hero who starts out, a little bit lost, and after a whole lot of trial and error, they finally figure out who they are. Well, that whole journey, from youth to maturity, it actually has a formal name.
And here it is, Bildungsroman. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. It's German, and it literally translates to a novel of formation, which, when you think about it, is the perfect way to describe a story that's all about how our experiences literally form us. But here's the really cool part. The coming-of-age story has had its own coming-of-age story. Seriously. Over the past 250 years, the way we tell these tales has changed so much, and it gives us this incredible window into how our whole idea of growing up has evolved right along with it. So here's the game plan. We're going to take a trip through time. We'll start back in the 18th century, when growing up was all about finding harmony. Then we'll jump into the 19th century's struggle for status, followed by the 20th century's obsession with alienation. And finally, we'll see where we've landed today with a major focus on identity.
All right, let's rewind the clock. We're in late 18th century Germany, right in the middle of the Enlightenment. This was a super optimistic time, full of big ideas about progress and reason, and no surprise, it produced a really optimistic kind of story. And you've got to understand, the original goal of the Bildungsroman was all about harmony. It was about showing a hero who successfully and, well, perfectly integrates into society. The whole point of the journey was to learn the rules of the world and find your ideal little spot within it.
So this original blueprint was built on a German concept called Bildung, which is all about self-cultivation. The model, which was pretty much set by Goethe's famous novel Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, was simple. A young hero wanders around, has some adventures, definitely makes some dumb mistakes, but, and this is key, they learn from it all and become a well-adjusted, productive member of society. Everyone ends up happy.
But then, things got a lot more complicated. As we move into the 19th century, the genre travels to Victorian England and to France, and the focus shifts. It's less about philosophical self-improvement and more about something way more practical, social ambition.
And you can really see two different paths emerging here. Over in England, with writers like Dickens and Bronte, the story is often this hopeful, if difficult, climb up a really rigid class ladder. But in France, with authors like Stendhal, the journey is so much more cynical. It's about ambition, for sure, but it often ends in disillusionment, with the hero making some pretty serious moral compromises along the way. This is the era that gave us some of our most classic story types. You've got the orphan, like Pip in Great Expectations, who starts with absolutely nothing and has to fight for a place in the world. And you have that fierce, powerful struggle for personal independence that you see so clearly in a character like Jane Eyre. And then, World War I happened. It just shattered everything. All those old certainties about society and progress, gone. And suddenly, the idea of happily fitting into a world that seemed so broken and corrupt, well, it just felt totally wrong. The coming-of-age story had to change again, drastically.
The goal did a complete 180. Instead of trying to fit in, the new hero's mission was to break out. Maturity wasn't about joining the world anymore. It was about finding a way to escape it. And very often, the escape route was through art. This shift actually gave rise to its own subgenre, the Künstlerroman. It literally means the artist's novel. So now the focus gets really narrow. It's not about general personal growth anymore. It's about the very specific development of an artist's mind, totally separate from mainstream society. And I honestly can't think of a better summary of this new ideal than this incredible line from James Joyce's masterpiece. The hero, Stephen Dedalus, has zero interest in joining his community. He wants to rise above it, to fly by those nets of country and family and religion and just be free to create. The new goal is complete artistic alienation. So that brings us pretty much up to the modern era. And here the genre gets picked up by writers from all sorts of marginalized communities. And they start asking a really important question. What does coming of age even mean when the world itself is set up to stop you from growing up? So what you start to see is a powerful challenge to that classic neat and tidy formula. For a lot of modern heroes, the journey of formation isn't some smooth, clear path. It's often blocked, it gets interrupted, or it's even left tragically unfinished because of huge forces like racism, poverty, and colonialism.
You see this everywhere. In post-colonial novels, a character's growth is often stunted by the forces of oppression. You see it in classic American young adult fiction, like The Catcher in the Rye, where the whole point is resisting becoming one of the phony adults. And you see it in amazing global stories like Persepolis, which is all about forging an identity while pushing back against massive systemic barriers. Okay, so let's take a breath and pull all these different threads together to really see the whole picture, the full evolution of growing up as seen through literature. So, let's just quickly walk through the journey again. We started with that 18th century dream of harmony and self-cultivation. Then we moved to the 19th century's obsession with climbing the social ladder. After that came the 20th century artist who wanted nothing to do with society. And that brings us to today, with our focus on identity and the fight against oppression.
You know, if you wanted to boil down the entire 250-year history of the Bildungsroman into a single thought, this is it right here. The hero's goal has shifted from fitting in to breaking out, and now to fighting back against the very structures of society itself.
Which kind of leaves us with one last big question. In our world, which is arguably more complex and confusing than ever, what does it really mean to come of age today? Is it about finding that inner harmony? Is it about achieving success? Is it about creating your own separate world? Or is it about fighting to make this one better? What does that journey look like for you? Something to think about. Today, we're going to dive into two classic, but really different, ways a character can come of age in a story. It's about building a place for yourself in the world versus stepping outside of it to create a world of your own. Just think about it for a second. In all those stories you've read about growing up, does the main character's big victory come from finally finding their spot in society? Or does their happiness actually depend on breaking away from it completely? That's the huge question we're getting into today. So here's our game plan. First, we'll define the two paths. Then, we'll get right to the core of it. They're totally opposite goals. We'll compare what their journeys look like side by side, look at a couple of classic examples, and wrap up by talking about why this whole distinction completely changes how we think about a happy ending. All right, let's get into it. To really get these two paths, we gotta know what they're called. Now, the names come from German literary theory, but don't worry, the ideas behind them are something we've all seen before. First up is the Bildungsroman. It sounds complicated, but it just means an education novel. This is your classic coming-of-age story. The hero learns, they grow, they make a ton of mistakes, but it's all pointing towards one goal: becoming a mature, functional member of society. They're kind of like an architect, carefully building a solid place for themselves inside the world that already exists. And then you've got the Künstlerroman, which is the artist novel. And this is a whole different ballgame. It's also about a character growing up, but it's totally focused on their journey as a creative, a writer, a painter, whatever. Their education isn't about fitting in. It's about finding their unique artistic voice. And, a lot of the time, it's in spite of the world around them. And here's where it gets interesting, how these two relate. An artist's story is still a type of coming-of-age story, right? So every Künstlerroman is, technically, a Bildungsroman. But, and this is the absolute key, most coming-of-age stories are not about artists. The real difference isn't the journey of growing up. It's the destination. Which brings us to the most important part of this whole explainer. This is the fork in the road, where our two heroes go their separate ways. And it all boils down to what they're trying to achieve. And those goals could not be more different. So here's the bottom line. The hero of the Bildungsroman, our architect, is all about integration. They want to find their place, they want to belong, they want to connect. But the hero of the Künstlerroman, our artist, they often realize that belonging is actually a trap. For them, the goal becomes alienation, a deliberate separation from society, because it's the only way they feel they can protect their unique vision and actually create their art. You can almost hear the motto of the Bildungsroman hero, can't you? It's just a deep sigh of relief. After this long, tough journey, they can finally say this: they've built their life, found their people, and they've settled in. For them, success is belonging. Now, contrast that with the artist's motto. This isn't a sigh of relief. It's a declaration of war, almost. For them, success needs distance. Why? Well, they believe that to truly see the world, to really capture it in their art, they can't be all tangled up and comfortable inside it. Their journey doesn't end in a warm home, but in a self-imposed creative exile. So let's look at how this huge difference in their final goals, finding your place versus leaving it behind, ends up shaping every single part of their stories. This table just lays it all out perfectly. The Bildungsroman hero is relatable, an everyman, right? Their conflict is classic, just them against the hardships of life. They learn from good mentors, and romance usually leads to marriage, which acts as this really stabilizing force. The story ends beautifully, with them settling down. But the Künstlerroman hero? Oh no, they're a sensitive, misunderstood soul, and their main conflict is this epic battle of art versus life. They find school to be totally stifling, love is just a distraction from their true purpose. And their story doesn't end with settling down, it ends with them taking flight. I know these ideas can feel a little abstract, so let's make them super concrete with two of the most famous examples you can find in literature. First up, our architect, Jane Eyre. I mean, she is the absolute poster child for the Bildungsroman hero. She is fiercely determined to carve out a life for herself within the very strict rules of her world. Jane's journey is just a perfect roadmap of integration. She starts out as a total outsider, full of this righteous anger. But through all the brutal experiences she has, she learns how to navigate society without losing who she is. And her story ends with the ultimate act of integration, a happy marriage that finally gives her a secure place in the world. She finds belonging, but she does it on her own terms. Okay, and now for our artist. Meet Stephen Dedalus from James Joyce's masterpiece, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And, well, his journey is the mirror opposite of Jane's. Stephen's entire life is basically a process of saying no. He feels completely suffocated by every institution that tries to shape him, his family, his church, his country. And he comes to this really stark realization. To become the artist he's meant to be, he has to just get rid of all of it. So his story doesn't end with a wedding. It ends with him making this radical choice to go into exile. And this right here, this is his famous declaration of artistic independence. These are the only tools he thinks he needs to create his art. It's got nothing to do with finding a place in the world. It's all about creating the right conditions to make art, even if that means leaving everything and everyone you've ever known behind. So we've got these two totally different paths, these two opposite goals. Why is it so important to know the difference? Well, because it completely changes how we decide if a story has a happy ending or not. And this just says it all. If Jane Eyre had ended her story alone, we would call that a tragedy, a total failure to achieve her goal of fitting in. But when Stephen Dedalus ends up alone, that's his triumph. It's the necessary, noble sacrifice he makes for his art. The genre itself tells us what a happy ending actually means. So I'll leave you with this to think about. When we look at our own lives and the stories we tell about them, what do we really value more? Is it the deep satisfaction of the architect who builds a life within society? Or is it the unique vision of the artist who has to stand apart to create something brand new? Which journey do you think is the real triumph? Okay, so today we're going to dive into one of the most fascinating characters in all of literature, Paul Morel from D.H. Lawrence's classic Sons and Lovers. Now, he's the hero of the story, but if you look closely at his journey, well, it looks a lot like a total and complete failure. And that's the big puzzle we're going to try and solve. I mean, think about it. By the end of the book, Paul is totally alone. He can't make a relationship work, his career is just there, and he's completely trapped by his past. By any normal measure, he's failed. So what gives? Why write a story about a hero who just doesn't win? To really get to the bottom of the Paul Morel problem, we need to look at his story through two very different lenses. You can think of them as two different roadmaps for what a hero's journey is supposed to look like. So on one side, you've got something called the Bildungsroman. This is your classic coming-of-age story, right? The hero grows up, learns the rules of society, gets a job, finds love, and basically finds their place in the world. But then on the other side, you have the Künstlerroman, and this is a totally different beast. It's the story of how an artist is born. And often, for that to happen, the hero has to reject society, not join it. So you can see we're talking about two completely opposite definitions of success here. So first up, let's put Paul on trial as a traditional hero. We're going to judge him using that first framework, the Bildungsroman, the story of a regular person trying to fit in. And when you use that yardstick, Oh man, the verdict is just brutal. If success means finding your place, a career, a partner, a stable life, then Paul Morel fails. He fails on every single level. His story isn't a success story. It's a tragedy about someone who just can't seem to grow up. And I mean, his failure is just comprehensive. Socially, he's completely stuck, caught in this intense psychological web woven by his mother. Romantically, it's a disaster. He just can't commit, not to Miriam, who offers him this deep spiritual connection, and not to Clara, who offers him passion. And his career? He's just kind of drifting along at a factory job. He never becomes a real pillar of his community. He doesn't tick a single box. But, and this is where it gets really, really interesting, what if we've been looking at this the wrong way? What if we've flipped the whole script and look at his journey from that second perspective, the artist's path? What if every single one of those things we just called a failure, his inability to love, to settle down, to just be normal, what if those weren't mistakes? What if they were actually required, necessary sacrifices for his true purpose? When you start to see Paul as an artist in The Waking, the hero of a Künstlerroman, suddenly everything just clicks into place. He's that classic, sensitive outsider, right? He doesn't fit in with the rough working-class world he was born into. And his painting? It's not just a hobby. It's his lifeline. It's the only place where he's truly in control, where he can define himself. All of a sudden, his rejection of a normal life doesn't look like failure anymore. It looks like he's protecting his artistic soul. And from this angle, even his train wreck relationships start to look like strategic moves. He has to reject Miriam because she wants to own his soul, the very thing he needs to create art. He has to move on from Clara because she only connects with his physical side and completely ignores the artist inside. And then, the most painful one of all, he has to break free from his mother, Gertrude. Yeah, she supports his art, but her love is so overwhelming, so all-consuming, it would suffocate him and stop him from ever becoming his own man. To become a creator, he first had to be free. The ultimate proof of this whole idea, the real clincher, comes in the final gut-wrenching moments of the novel. It all comes down to the choice Paul makes right at the very end. So his mother dies, and Paul is just completely shattered. He's standing on a ledge, looking into this abyss, and he's so tempted to just let go and follow her into the darkness of death. This is it. This is his final test. Is he going to give in to despair, or is he going to choose the hard, painful path of life? And in the book's final, powerful lines, he makes his choice. Lawrence writes, "But no, he would not give in. Turning sharply, he walked towards the city's gold phosphorescence. He literally turns his back on death, on the darkness, and walks towards the light of the city, towards life, towards experience, towards everything he'll need to fuel his art." So let's bring it all together. Let's put these two clashing viewpoints head to head and come up with a final verdict. Paul Morel, failure or success? It really just all comes down to how you look at it. Through that social Bildungsroman lens, his mother is a huge obstacle, his relationships are total failures, and the ending is just tragic. But if you look at it through the artistic, Künstlerroman lens, his mother's death becomes the very thing that sets him free. The women in his life become material for his art, and the ending isn't tragic at all. It's incredibly hopeful. He's finally free to become who he was meant to be. So the final verdict is this: yes, Sons and Lovers is absolutely 100% a failed Bildungsroman. Paul does not succeed as a conventional man finding his happy little place in society. But that's the whole point. His failure in that first story is exactly what allows his second story to succeed. He had to fail as a son and as a lover so that he could finally get the chance to be born as a creator. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. Is this a story of success or a story of tragedy? I guess it all depends on what you think is more valuable. A happy, conventional life fitting in with everyone else, or the lonely, painful, but maybe, just maybe, triumphant birth of an artist.